The idea of talking about megatrends is to elucidate the context of biodiversity loss and biodiversity protection. Biodiversity always competes for priorities, for topics, with other topics and priorities. That's the day-to-day business of policy advisors and policy makers. What I want to do with you now is to take a more long-term view into the future, to understand which megatrends, so structural long-term changes in society, economy, technology and nature, which of these megatrends shape the future context of biodiversity and its opportunities for reversing declines in nature. And what we see is that nature and its vital contributions to people, which together embody biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, are deteriorating worldwide. And they're doing that faster today than in any previous time of history. The report identifies direct and indirect drivers of global change in nature, and they show that these drivers have accelerated in the past 50 years. Still, they come to the conclusion that goals for conserving and sustainable using nature and achieving sustainable development can be achieved, but they cannot be achieved by current policies or human activities. What they require for achievement is transformative changes across, like megatrends, economic, social, political, and technological factors. And what this requires is concerted and unified action, and obviously not only at local levels but also at global levels. It is important to understand that they are of long duration, they are ubiquitous, so they have a global impact. It's not equal across regions, but it is of global importance, and it impacts across sectors and space. So a technological change which impacts all aspects of production and consumption would be considered as a megatrend, but not if it's just a very circumvented impact and change. And it has an impact on day-to-day activities of people. So it is something everybody somehow perceives in his or her livelihood, in his or her daily routines. And another important aspect of megatrends is that they are interlinked. So you won't understand or be able to control a megatrend if you look at it in isolation. You have to look at them in their network, in their interlinked dynamics and impacts. So does this apply to biodiversity, ecosystems, and nature's contributions to people? I understand that yes, because it is a long-term trend, and biodiversity loss and weakened contributions of nature to people's well-being can be felt in nature, it comes from nature, and it has an impact also on nature back, so a negative feedback. It impacts on society, on economy, on politics also. We have seen the emergence of green parties, for example, of a lot of NGOs, of grassroots movements to defend ecosystems and biodiversity, to defend livelihoods that depend on direct contributions of nature. And what we also see, and you can find all that in the IPBES global assessment, are interlinkages to climate change, to technological change, and to globalization, if you think of invasive species. Which other megatrends exist actually, and which do we need to understand for placing biodiversity loss and declines in nature in an accurate understanding of future developments? Let's have a look at a selection of 8 megatrends which we did at DIE for a foresight exercise demanded by us from BMZ. We are distinguishing megatrends of first order. These are the ones which are marked in red on this graph, from other megatrends which also are mega, but which are not as determining as the ones of first order. So the first order trends are climate change and resource scarcity, demographic change, and geopolitical power shifts. While the ones of second order are globalization versus regionalization. So in a way, this is a sort of a double-faced trend. It describes the oscillation of global economic production and consumption structures between globalization and regionalization. Then we have social inequalities and the rise of new global middle classes. We have migration, urbanization, and in the end, we also have digitalization and knowledge societies. And the type of the evolution lines you see on this graph are not based on calculations. This is a descriptive graph, and it shows on the horizontal axis, it shows time, so 2020 is last year, 2050 and the end of the century, and on the horizontal axis, it's the starting point today and how a desirable evolution or an evolution between desired results and plausible results looks like, taking the interaction between them into consideration. This sounds complicated, but let me explain it to you. Climate change and resource scarcity. What you see there is that today we have high levels of emissions, so it's mainly focusing on emissions. And what countries have pledged in the Paris Agreement is to have a reduction. And we depict here a slower reduction in the next ups and downs in the next 30 years, but a move downwards until the end of the century. And the idea here is that it will be close to what is needed for avoiding dangerous climate change. So keep it below 2 degrees. Then demographic change, we are less optimistic. We think that it will continue, human population will continue to grow, but then it will decelerate at around the mid-century. And geopolitical power shifts, there you see it is a very much oscillating tendency because the durability of power shifts depends very much on economic growth rates and on stable regimes. And stability is not only a matter, as you know, of controlling the state apparatus, but of trust between population and the regime, and orderly relations within a society which are guaranteed by the state in terms of rule of law and in terms of having a peaceful change in political power hold. So, and this is one thing why this line will always oscillate. But the other reason why we have painted this as oscillating is because we define geopolitical power shifts also as creating pressure on OECD countries, on the EU, the US, Japan, to redefine their relations with emerging economies and emerging societies. And this is also not a straightforward process, as we have just seen with the ending presidency of President Trump, that it is difficult for OECD countries to adjust to the new role they have in global economic and political affairs, as much as it is also for emerging economies to understand and act according to the new global responsibilities which come to them. So this is why this is oscillating. And of course, the fact that the line then is painted as going downwards means that there will be less stress and less crisis in these relations. So all countries will adjust in a constructive, positive way to this new global governance system, multipolar governance system, and the degree of conflicts accompanying these power shifts will decrease. That's why the line goes down. So down-going lines are positively meant in this context. The other megatrends, you will see many of them remain at a relatively high level, and this applies to migration movements. We consider that they will belong to our world in this century. They won't go away. Urbanization won't go away, and digitalization and the importance of knowledge won't go away. We think that there will be a new balance between globalization and regionally organized economies. That's why the line remains stable at a different level than today after 2050. And we also believe that there will be found a new balance in distributing wealth. So inequalities will be constantly, sustainably reduced, and middle classes will become a global, as constant global phenomenon. Where I have integrated a graph from the IP-based global assessment on the drivers of declines in nature and put the megatrends, which I just briefly explained, on the left side. So I have grouped them in a way that you can see megatrends which are closely interacting with each other. And on the top I have put demographic change, because the size of populations, especially when they converge economically with OECD countries, determines the size of their economies and the impacts they have in the positive as in the negative way on nature and on political processes and on economic relations. So whether populations will grow or stagnate is important. And that's also why I grouped inequality, new middle classes there, migration, urbanization, and globalization, regionalization. These are main trends whose actual outcome, the way they play out, will depend very much on the way or the quality of governance systems and regulation towards the common good, and regimes being able to see the common good and act accordingly. And this will have a strong impact on the shape, these indirect drivers, which are mentioned in the IPBES, demographic and social-cultural, economic and technological, institutions and governance, conflicts and epidemics. These are all influenced by these megatrends. So putting these two graphs in context may help you to understand that we are not talking, when we look at the indirect drivers and how they affect human activities, which here is actually called direct drivers, in agriculture mostly, in land use, in fisheries, in polluting activities, and that these are not constant and never changing processes, but these are affected by these megatrends I just mentioned, and therefore will change over time. So the next slide shows a graph which I took from the Human Development Report in 2019, which depicts which depicts different countries and shows the level of human development they have achieved on the horizontal axis and the associated global footprint, so the environmental use, which goes along with, which characterizes these societies. So the more to the right a circle is, the higher the human development of its society, and the lower it is the closer it is to the bottom, the lower the smaller its global footprint. You see two large circles in the middle between medium human development and high human development, and they describe India and China. They are the countries with the largest population sizes and with growing global footprints because of reduced poverty. And here you can see that what I mentioned before, that the more a society converges with rich countries, the larger the impact it has on nature. What this graph shows is that so far, advances in reducing human poverty are connected with increasing ecological footprints. So this is a trend we will have to change for the sake of preserving human livelihoods. And the recipes for that are clear. It's increasing renewable energies and energy efficiency, introducing circular economy and protecting environment and nature as such. And these are recipes or recommendations you also find in the IPBES report, but obviously the question is how this can be forwarded. But let's have a look at the next trend. First of all, this is demographic change. What you see here is a graph developed by UNDESA in 2015, where they corrected the population data for many countries and where they show different developments starting in these years, whether the most optimistic scenario is that population growth dynamics will stagnate. There are more pessimistic ones and a very pessimistic one where we would arrive at 11.9 billion people on Earth. The most optimistic one would leave us at 8.7 billion people on Earth. The important point here is that we see a dramatic change in the composition of the age structure. In 2050, that's the prediction, more than 21% of the world population will be over 60 years old. In 1950, as comparison, it was only 8% of the world population. So what does this mean? Older people generally have less active consumption patterns. At some stage, they have reached satisfaction, so to say. They don't see the need to exchange furniture to live somewhere else or so. So from the perspective of an ever-growing economy, this is worrying because your consumption patterns will change towards stagnation. But from the perspective of having a more sufficient economy and reducing overconsumption, this has actually positive potential. And another point which is important here is that what is the main factor behind decreasing population growth? It is investing in the education of girls and women and increasing the female share in the workforce, having decent jobs for women and protecting their rights. So this means for biodiversity politics, this is an important ally, investing in the empowerment of girls and women. On the left side, you see the size of the economies in 2017, and on the right side, you see the size, the projected size of economies in 2030. And you see that the three largest economies are China, India, and then comes the US in 2030. And you see that Russia, Japan, and Germany barely make it to the last three positions on this ranking. So you see here a very big shift in economic power. You see that it illustrates what has recently been called the Asian century, the 21st century being Asian, because that's where major economic power will reside. If you had a green pen, how would you depict a green line for biodiversity loss and declines in nature? After having heard about what these megatrends are, how they interact, and how they could develop, where would you paint this green line? I haven't been able to do this. Maybe it would follow the line which we see here for climate change and resource scarcity. but what would be required for this line to change, to behave in that way, that declines in nature shrink again and do not progress? There are many factors which need to be considered there, and some of them are mentioned in the IPBES report. One is solutions for mitigating climate change and adapting to it need to be nature friendly. I think that this is a crucial point to bring into discussions on the connections between climate change and biodiversity loss. Geopolitical change and the rise of Asia, what will be its economic and its political impacts? Will this be positive for biodiversity or will it be negative? What will be the impact when we think about globalization and regionalization? What will be the impact of the African continent-wide free trade area? Will that enhance local economic development and at the same time strengthen public policies and implementation capacities of African governments? What will be the role of international cooperation in this context? What will be China doing in Africa in this respect? What is important, what I would like to stress here, is that the IPBES report does not only have a natural science-informed look at biodiversity, but it stresses very much the importance of values and norms for changing lifestyles and consumption patterns. So it takes, in that sense, a positive approach and in another way also a realist approach, saying that human behavior does not automatically follow economic dynamics. It also creates economic dynamics, and it can change social and public discourses on what is valued, what needs to be protected, and how a good human life should look like, which is in harmony with nature. And there are some trends, megatrends, which contribute to making the opportunities larger for having a review of values and norms and changing them in a constructive way. Reducing inequalities and strengthening middle classes can have a positive impact on understandings of what a good life is. A strengthening of regional economies can also contribute to that, as can urbanization. We have seen in our analysis that digital technologies are very helpful for promoting local economies, local urban economies, for example, and local citizens' movements by connecting them to each other and offering alternatives to traditional ways or conventional ways of producing and supplying. Digitalization can promote participatory processes of forming political wills, of developing alternatives to current ways of doing things. They are obviously, digital technologies are obviously very important for strengthening also science systems. Science systems will very much depend on international cooperation, as will innovation systems, and they have to become more open. And what is not mentioned in these graph, and which is not mentioned as a megatrend, but it could also be described as one. What about rule of law and participation in the formation of political will and public policies as a prerequisite of sustainable development? I think this is a very important factor which needs to be strengthened, and where some of the megatrends I mentioned could work in both ways, but could also help to support and strengthen the role of public policies and governments. What are the limits and the opportunities of megatrends? I have listed some keywords here which refer to the megatrends, and which I have mentioned already before. Asian century, reduce inequalities, the importance of regions, digitalization, migration, urbanization, and aging society. They can be seen as threats, and I think they are threats for business as usual development. But we are actually looking at opportunities, and I think if we formulate the megatrends in this way, we can also see the opportunities which arise from them for a better harmony between human societies and nature. Thank you.